Well, I just kind of want to welcome you back to the series that we kind of kicked off last week called Following Directions or Follow Directions. A series created just for men. Not really. It's actually it's actually for everybody because here's the truth, ladies. You're either going to have to deal with one, date one, marry one, give birth to one, work with one. Sounding depressing already, isn't it? Go to school with one. You're going to have to deal with them, right? I mean, that's just true. And even if you're a man, you got to deal with other men. I mean, that's just kind of where we are. We all have to deal with it, with where we are and what we are. And so we're talking about it. And the truth of it is, this is a pretty controversial subject, especially in our culture today. I don't know if you're really aware of that. And you say, well, what's so controversial about it? Because we're talking about what it means to be a man. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but there's a lot of confusion about that in our world today. What it means to be a man. And what does it mean to be a good man, right? And by good, I'm talking about what it is that God intended and created us to be when it agrees with what He says, right? That a man is and a man is not. And so that's kind of what we're talking about. Thus, all the signs, because we're talking about following His directions, which I'll allude to a little bit more in just a moment. And the thing that we got to keep in mind, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this because this is kind of the crux of where I'm going, is what it truly means to be a man. And I say truly because we're talking about truth. Truth is important. It's critical. Truth is defined like this. It's what stands up whenever the storm hits. It stands up regardless of reality hitting. It's what holds during the test of time. This is important to understand. We got to get that. Jesus kind of put it like this. He said, if you take hold of and put into practice what I say is true and build your life on it like a rock, then whenever the storms of life, whenever reality hits, you're going to be able to withstand that storm because it's built on truth. And truth works best in reality. That's just the way it is. So with all that in mind, in today's world, in case you need to be brought up to speed, there's a real negative view today of masculinity. Harvey Weinstein, movie mogul, do I need to say more? A lot of negative connotations and misunderstandings of what real masculinity is all about. And the solution that our culture seems to be pitching as a result of that, and seems to be proposing, is that what we need to do is just throw out masculinity. Get rid of it. Dumb it down. Redefine what it means to be a man into something that it was never meant to be, something that is not true and will not work. Why won't it work, Sammy? Because it's not true, and only true holds up in reality. That's why I said that at the beginning. So the big question is what is the solution? What is the answer to all this dysfunction that we see today with regard to being men and being women? Well, that's kind of what I'm going to talk about a bit today. You know, there's a word that gets overused a little bit to define our society, but I think it's pretty accurate. It's the word toxic. Everybody talks about the world is toxic, or society is toxic. And I would agree with that. Do you know what the opposite of toxic means? You can look it up. Here's what the opposite of toxic is. The opposite of toxic is harmless, powerless, and impotent. Now, I got to confess to you, I don't want to be toxic, but I don't want to be any of those three either. Right? Now, the reason I mentioned that, hear me out, do you know what the opposite of the word masculine is? You know that, right? It's feminine. Right? The opposite of masculine is feminine. That's not because I made it up. That's grammatically, that's just true. And the reason I mention that is because there's this huge push today as a result of all the negative views of masculinity that what would make it better, let's propose this. Let's propose that all men and women just act and look alike. That's the answer. That's what we need to push in our society. So, as a result, men, therefore, to be a part of that, have to surrender their masculine power and their strength. Don't judge me, hear me out, and act like women. And I'm not saying women aren't strong. I'm married to one, and she's strong. Not suggesting that at all. What I'm suggesting is we're different. We're just different. I mean, when you think about the idea, the proposal, everybody to act the same, I mean, that doesn't even sound right when I verbalize it, right? I mean, it just doesn't sound right. Because even if men acted like women, there's something inside of us, intuitively, we know it's just not right, that men and women are different. And you can push back against it, you can fight it, but it's just absolutely true. And if that difference is lived out, the differences that we have as male and female, if those differences are lived out in a good way, in a true way, in the way that we were created and intended, then it becomes what God said it was at the very beginning when He created them male and female. He says it's very good. And that's our aim. That's our goal, to have it look very good. And so trying to force men to be something or not and trying to force them to pretend women are something that they aren't, it's never going to end well. And the reason it's not going to end well is because in reality it's not true. It's just not true. We can fake it for a while, but... So what's the answer? What's the answer to all this toxic masculinity? Is it to throw out masculinity? I would suggest this. What if the answer to what we see as bad masculinity, what if the answer is actually true good masculinity? I mean, doesn't that sound logical? That kind of sounds like the right idea. And what I mean by that, masculinity as it is expressed and manifested in the way that it was created and intended to be. So then we follow up with this question, well, how do you know that? Right? And who knows how to do that? Where do you turn to find out what masculinity is really intended to be? Well, I don't know. Let's start with this like we would anything else. Like if you bought a piece of equipment, guys, or a piece of machinery, or ladies, maybe you buy an appliance of some sort, right? You have to get the manual out and you read how it works, right? Before you can operate it. You read how, you put it together and how you turn it on and plug it and all that kind of thing. And then if it breaks, and by the way, if you haven't figured this out, anything that can will break, right? That's a law of nature right there. So you need to know how to fix it. Well, how do you do that? I don't know. Maybe you go back to the directions. Maybe, doesn't that kind of seem like the right thing to do? You go back to the manufacturer, the one who put it together, the one who built it, the one who has the patent on it. You go back to the one who invented it, and you read the intended purpose of it, and then you go from there. So my goal in this series let's go back to the one who decided to build man in the beginning, because that just sounds logical. It's interesting that whenever Jesus was asked tough questions, and he was asked tough questions all the time, his answer was he always looked back and said, well, let's go back to the beginning. Let's go back to what it was, to the one who set it up and what they intended it to be. Last week, I kind of compared it to a knife. So I brought a knife of mine. I told y'all I have a bunch of knives. This is my hunting knife. But that's not really a knife. Let me show you my other knife. Now this is a knife. It's a knife. Why in the world, Sammy, do you have that knife? Because I can. And I like knives. I actually bought this knife to strap alongside my kayak. I don't know. I just thought maybe one day I might feel manly and want to stab a fish. I don't know. Instead of catch one the old-fashioned way. But anyway, I just kind of feel safer with this attached to the side of my kayak. So I got this knife. And you know what's interesting about a knife? Any knife. When it's held in the right hand, it can be productive. It can defend. It can protect. It can do constructive things. But what's interesting about this same knife, if it's in the wrong hand, it can be dangerous, right? It can do a lot of harm. It can hurt a lot of people, be destructive. It can even murder, right? So according to which hand it's in, according to what can be done with it. Now, I say all that because here's what I want you to understand. I'll tell you what the answer is not with regard to knives. The answer is not to ban all knives. Well, let's just get rid of all the knives. That way nobody has a chance to ever get hurt by a knife anymore. Or how about this? This is another idea. And by the way, I hope you figured out I'm not really talking about knives. But let's take all the knives and let's just dull them all up. Let's grind down all the edges of the knives, and we can still have them, but they really can't be effective. And if you know anything about knives, sometimes a dull knife can be more dangerous than a sharp one. Think with me now. What about this proposal? What about if we take a knife and sharpen it to its greatest potential and then train the one who's holding it to use it in the proper way? Doesn't that sound like it's a little bit more logical than trying to round up all the knives or dull them all down? But isn't that exactly what we're doing with gender issues and masculinity and femininity today? Isn't that exactly what the proposal is? See, anything has the potential of doing good, always has the potential of doing harm, right? When something that was meant to be used for good is used in a way that's not meant to be, always somebody gets hurt. And what we have a tendency to do in our culture is we knee-jerk react, and we have this tendency to take our anger and push it in the wrong direction. Somebody gets hurt by a knife, and all of a sudden we're mad at the knife. And we want to sue the manufacturer. We want to round up all the knives, get rid of all the knives when somebody misuses it in a way that was meant to be, even though we had directions on how to use it all along. We just didn't pay attention to them. We didn't teach them. And so what we try to do is we try to get rid of it. Get rid of it. So let's get rid of masculinity. Let's get rid of femininity. Let's all be alike. Let's get rid of it. I told you last week that my directions for proper use of my crossbow clearly stated the following, that improper use of this crossbow could be fatal, causing serious injury and maybe even or cause death. But for some reason, we read the directions and we don't believe them. And we don't want to abide by them. We don't want to handle it and use it according to how it was intended in its proper use, said everyone who ever went into an emergency room. Right? This is true. My point is this, is what's true for knives and what's true for crossbows is true for people, and especially true for men as we're talking about it. Now here's the honesty that we have to face with regard to this subject. Men, we've been guilty, not just in our culture, not just in our day, not just in our generation, but throughout history, we have been guilty of abusing and misusing our power. And the reason is that something is broken. And as a result, what I see today is a lot of young men particularly living in anger and frustration. But I want you to know it's not new to us. This has been going on and can be traced back all to the same source. And here's what I would suggest. There comes a time when every man and every woman in our life, we have to make a choice. We have to make a decision to do something. And that's what I want to look at just for the next few moments here today together. I'm going to be in the book of Romans. Now, I don't know if you know where Romans is. It's in the New Testament, about halfway back. It's a letter that was written to the Italian Christians in Rome. There was a church started there. Paul wanted to go. He's in Israel. He can't go, so he writes them a letter. He visits them later. But they're facing very similar situations in their culture that we're facing in ours. And he writes some very important things, kicking it off in Romans chapter 1. And I want to encourage you to read that chapter on your own, but I want to read a few verses to you and remind you of some truth. Romans chapter 1 verse 18 says this, that the wrath of God, mark that, is being revealed. We can see it from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people. Why? Who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Wrath of God. You know what wrath of God means, that phrase? It means anger that has consequences. In other words, God looks at something, it angers him, and he says, you're going to have to pay for that. There's going to be consequences for that. Now, I'm not here to give you a lesson on the original language in Greek, but in the word study, if you were to look at it, the wrath of God also entails something else here. It also is referring to the grief of God. That God looks at men and women and families and in our situations and the choices that we're making today. and we're not choosing Him, and it grieves His heart. And the reason it grieves His heart is He knows when He looks down and He sees the messes that we get ourselves into, that every mess was totally avoidable if we just followed the directions. And every parent in this room knows exactly what I'm talking about because you've been through it. You have a kid, you tell them what they should do, right? And you need to do this. It's in your own best interest. And they say, no, thanks. And they do something else. And then all of a sudden you have that conversation. Well, now you're going to have to pay for that. You threw the rock through that window, and now you're going to have to pay for that. There's going to be consequences for that. And now you're going to have some pain that you've brought on to yourself. But as a parent, whenever your kid does something that brings pain to them, it actually grieves your heart because you know they could have avoided it if they just listened to you. How do you think God feels looking at us? That's what Paul is saying here. He said, you knew what was true, and you made a choice just like every one of us in this room have at some point, and you've pushed it aside and said, no thanks. So he goes to verse 19. Now I'm going to change the pronouns here a little bit just to make it personal. Understand that the Bible Romans wasn't just written to some Christians and, Italian Christians. It was written to us as well. So let's make this personal here, okay? He talks about the wrath, and then in verse 19 he says, since what may be known about God is plain to us, we can look around, we can see it, because God has made it plain to us. Well, what are you talking about? Well, look around. See how it all works. He goes on, he gets more detail. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, all that stuff we can't see, actually can be seen in how it works in the world. His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made. You and I can go out at night and we can look at the stars, we can look at the sunrise, we can look at the sunset, we can look at how trees and flowers and everything operates in nature. So that what has been made, people, therefore, you and I are without excuse. Do you know what you call someone without an excuse? You call that person accountable. That's what you call them. Don't miss this. Paul is saying there is some level of truth that God has placed intuitively inside of every single person that's ever been born. Did you know that? You should from your own experience. You say, well, how do you know that, Sammy? Because we're created in His image and His likeness, and He puts something within us that says, I am here and I'm like this. I knew that at a very young age. I knew when I was very young that I was a boy, and I'm here. And I've got to try now to figure out why I'm here. That was put in me by God, put in you by God. And then he says, you're able to look around at the world that I've created. Listen, don't miss this. You can look at nature, you can look at biology, you can look at anatomy. Some of you need to stop looking at anatomy. But anyway, looking at anatomy and animals and planets and human beings and relationships, you can look around and God says, I've put enough truth inside of you and around you to hold you accountable to the fact that, yes, there is a God and He must be like this. This is how He's supposed to work. This is how life is supposed to work. Now, I don't know about you, but for me, that's a pretty convicting statement. Should be for you as well. It's interesting to me that a lot of scientists even today will say, most scientists will say today, that if you want to know how things work, look at the universe. The universe teaches us how things work, right? That's how from observation, we learn through the universe how things work. Reality and biology will show you what works. And here's the thing, what works lasts and what doesn't work, you know what happens to it? Pay attention, read between the lines, goes extinct. And what's interesting is what they're saying, even though a lot of them don't realize it, is that biology, chemistry, and nature ultimately agrees with God. And the reason is, we know it does, is because biology and chemistry and physics were all His idea to begin with, so He knows how it works best. Right? Guys, when we were young and when we went to school, we used to use these things in school, I don't even know if they have them anymore, called pencils. Do they even use pencils in school anymore? They do? Oh, I've been out a long time. Number 2 pencil. And my mother used to buy me a big box of number 2 pencils. You want to know why? Not because I used them all up doing my homework. Because I used to sit in class and see how far I could bend them before I break them. Every guy in here's done that. Bend that pencil and you go, I believe you can take a little bit more. Pop. Snap, right? And my point is this, you can bend the truth all you want for a while and you can pretend that something isn't true for a while, but I'm telling you, if what you think is true doesn't line up with what God says is true, it's only a matter of time before it will self-correct and it will snap. And the pain will probably fall out on you. Jesus put it like this in the Harris paraphrase. You can do anything you want to do in the dark for a while, but there's coming a day, Jesus warned in the directions. There's coming a day when I'm going to pull it all out into the light and expose it for what it really is. And when that happens on that day, there's going to be consequences. That isn't my teaching, that's his. So this is what Paul is saying. He's saying, okay, you want to know why the world is so messed up and why we're so confused? It's because we've been taking truth and we've been trying to bend it into something that's not true. And then it snaps on us. And we go, well, why did that break? Because it wasn't true. We weren't using it the way it was supposed to be used. And down inside, here's the thing about every one of us in this room, we know that. We knew, we're looking back on our lives, that things that we decided to do, they weren't a good idea when we did them, and it didn't turn out well. And the reason so many of us have so much pain in our lives today and now is because truth and reality caught up with us, and now it's self-correcting. Through the laws of nature, it doesn't work according to the directions because we're trying to make it work in a way it was never intended to work. Relationships, if you haven't figured it out, that's what I'm talking about. Okay? So the next few verses lead to the root cause of everything because we have a tendency to choose the wrong option. So let's look at these verses. Again, changing the pronouns a little bit, make it more personal. Verse 21. For although we knew God, I'm going to make an assumption everybody who came here today knows something about God or you wouldn't be here, right? For although we knew God, we neither glorified Him as God or gave thanks to Him, but in our thinking we become futile and our foolish hearts were darkened. Although we claim to be wise, well, I've got a good education, we become fools. Why? We exchange the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being, and birds and animals and reptiles and boats and I don't know, whatever else you want to throw in there. God says, I made you, and this is how you work best in the reality that I've created around you. And you know what our response has been? No thanks, I don't want that. That doesn't feel right. I want to do something different. Now hear me on this. This is important. You have that choice. You have a free will. You can make that decision if you want, but understand what's coming next in verse 24. Understand that God will respond to that, and probably not in the way that you think. Let's look at it. Because of the pushback and saying, I don't want to follow your directions on life and how it works best, God, it says, therefore, what God then does is He gives us over to our sinful desires of our hearts to sexual impurity, the degrading of our bodies with one another. We exchange the truth of God for a lie. There's the exchange. And we worship and serve created things rather than our Creator who is forever praised. Amen. In other words, he throws an amen in there because he's saying that's just how it is. That's the problem. Now, I don't know about you. I read that. That's one of the saddest verses in the entire Bible. Here's what I know about looking back on my life, the lives of others that I've cared about through the years. Here's what Paul is trying to remind us of here, a truth that is so important. There comes a point in your life when you tell God to butt out of your life over and over and over and over again, where God says, well, if you would just, and you go, no thanks. I want to do it differently. I don't want to do it your way. I want to do it my way. There comes a point when you do that enough eventually that God will eventually look back at you. This is what Paul is saying. And He will throw you the keys and say, okay, run your own life. You want it? You got it. Here's the keys. Drive your own life. Do it your way. But understand this, it's your choice. And with your choice is going to come your consequences. I got something else in mind for you, but you don't want it. So here, you drive it. Now, I want to be very clear before I go any further because I've heard a lot of bad teaching on this. I want to make very, very crystal clear. I am not suggesting in any way, shape, or form, and I don't think there's any verse to back it up, that God He never gives up on you. That's not what I'm suggesting here. I'm not suggesting that. But there does come a point. There does come a point where God will give you over to yourself to follow your own heart instead of Him, because you have said over and over, get out of my life, get out of my life, I don't want it, so sorry, no thanks. We make a choice. We make a bad exchange. And what did we swap out? Verse 25 again tells us, we exchanged the truth about God for a lie. We hold on to something that's not true. And what's not true? We worship and serve the things He created rather than the Creator. See, God doesn't hide anything from us. He always wants what's best for us. He wants us to have an abundant life, to have life and have it to the full. So what we have here is we have what God says is true, and it's either been taught to you or it's been intuitively put inside of you from birth, but you just know certain things. Now, for some of us, I will say this, that the definitions of truth have been broken in our lives. And that is true. Even though you still have a little bit of it in you, for some of us, it's been broken because maybe you didn't have a dad, so you don't know how to be a man, or you didn't have a mom, or whatever the case may be, and so we had to make it up as we go. And so for a long time, we find ourselves holding on to things that aren't actually true. But God says, I want to remind you of something, and don't forget this. You cannot use that as an excuse. Because I've put enough truth in you that's going to create naturally some tension where you are going to then have the choice to pursue truth or listen to truth as it's being taught to you, or you're going to push back and say no thanks. You're going to have that inside of you. And maybe you say, well, how can you say that? Well, I can say that for all of you and for me because we're here. Why else would we be here, right? And it's not because of me, it's because God brought you into this room somehow, some way. Something either inside or from the outside that influenced you, that's why you're here. And so God says, this is true, and our response is to choose it, right? Or we can choose that something else is true, even though we know it's a lie, or we choose to value something else more than we choose to value God, which means that we worship it. And by the way, your life will always show what it is that you worship. Said that many times. But even though we know it's not going to always end well, we have a tendency to jump into something else and we choose it over God, and what He says will actually last forever. You know, I was preparing for this series, and I got to thinking, I get a lot of advertisements just like you through media, TV, paper, whatever, all the time. And one of the things that I noticed is that we really are the generation of knockoffs. Do you know what I mean by that? There are so many people that are trying to sell us stuff that's a knockoff. They say, buy this, it's much cheaper, and it's just as good as the original. Do you know who the prince of that is? Well, of course you do. That's what Satan's been doing us from day one, right? He's been trying to sell us something at a cheaper rate and saying it's just like the original, and it's not. It's a knockoff. Now, I'm not going to read the rest of this chapter. I can spend 10 weeks on the rest of this chapter. I want you to go home and read it for yourself. But it gives a long list of always what happens when you decide to exchange what God said is true for a lie. And there's a lot of detail in Romans 1 there. Especially if you exchange what God gave to you as a woman or God gave to you as a man. And when you exchange that, he talks about that. I want you to take it home and read it. I've told you many times in the past, I've always loved to study history. When I went to Bible college, I had as many history classes as I did Bible classes, which probably is reflected in my preaching. I'm not sure, but I love history. I had all kinds of history. I had local history, I had government, I had U.S. history, I had history of civilizations, I had history of denominations, I history of the church from the very beginning, all this, lots of history classes. I love history of civilization. And I learned a lot in that class, but one of the things, I guess, overlaying from civilization to civilization as you go through history that I found out, and it's quite true, you can look this up for yourself, you don't have to take my word for it, is that there is a cycle that gets repeated with the greatest empires that's ever been known to man. It's just a cycle. You can look at, now the years of how long it lasts different, or vary. But whether or not you go all the way back to the Egyptian Empire or to the Roman Empire that we talk a lot about, or then you go, to the Chinese Empire, to the Mongolian Empire, you got all these empires, Persian Empire. Then you go to the British Empire, or now what a lot of people call the U.S. of A. Empire. That, strongest nation in the world, most influential nation in the world. When you look at all those empires and you look at the history, one of the things that you figure out quite quickly is that history kind of has a cycle and it kind of repeats itself. There's what starts out as a need and starts out as being a true need, and then the society picks something else up and says, no, I'd rather do this. And one of the things that you learn about studying empires is that all the major civilizations in the world did not come to ruin or end because of military threat from without, but from moral decay within. Isn't that interesting? When the bedrock of society, which is called the family, began to deteriorate, so did the empire. Every time, no matter what empire you talk about. It's always the same cycle. And here's how it goes. And again, read it yourself. Read history. Here's how it goes. First of all, gender comes under attack. There's gender confusion, redefinition of what is a man and what is a woman every single time, all through history. Followed then by sexually acting out in that dysfunction. Every single time, men trying to be women, women trying to be men, and that dysfunction then leads to the destruction of the bedrock of society, which is the home, the family, and husbands and wives, or what God calls, becoming one, marriage. Okay? And I'm not making a political statement here. I just want you to understand. I'm not reading this out of the Washington Post. I'm reading this out. Romans 1 was written 2,000 years ago. Okay? It's the same old story for the same old reason. It's when people look back and say, I don't want your directions. I don't need your directions. Don't tell me what to do. And eventually God looks back and says, okay, go for it. Have it your way. But just so you know, in full disclosure, I'm going to show you where it ends up. And it's not where you want to end up. But it's nothing new. Nothing new. Now, some of you are here this morning, you're saying, wait a minute, I'm a little confused. I thought you were going to talk about becoming a man. All you've talked about is the problem, and you're right. Because we have to address that before. I'm going to get to the good stuff next week when we talk more about becoming a man. But even if I told you what God today said is true of you and what is possible for you, you wouldn't believe it, because if you would have, you would already have done it. So we got to talk about what we believe first. You got to talk about truth first. So let me conclude today with some important questions. What is it that you really want for your life? As a man, what do you want? What kind of man would you be if you had whatever it is that you want? What kind of man would you be if you had that? Okay? Then followed by the question, well, why don't you have it? Why aren't you the man that you want to be and need to be for those around you? Followed by this, what's holding you back from that? Okay? Because here's what I'm here to tell you today. While I'm still trying to work on it and I'm far from where I want to be, I've read the directions many times that God has given us on this particular issue, and He's really pretty clear. He's saying, I'm going to tell you who you are because I created you. I'm going to tell you what your purpose is for being here. I'm going to give you a mission, and then to top it all off, I'm going to be with you to the end of the age and make sure that you have the source and the strength and the power to get it done. Now, I don't know about you, but that sounds like a pretty good plan. That kind of sounds like what we need, and that's the goal. There has to be this moment where we look at where we've been and where we are, and we say, I want something different, and I'm going to get up and I'm going to actually start doing something different. So my question to you guys today is this, is what kind of man, what kind of husband, what kind of father, what kind of coach, what kind of uncle, what kind of brother, what kind of son do you really want to be? What could you be? What do you want? Let me get real personal, guys. What do you want your wife, if you're married, what do you want your wife to say about you to her friends as you as a husband? To which you're sitting there thinking, well, I don't want her to say anything to her friends. Guess what? She does anyway. She always will. What do you want your children not only to say now at a young age, but when they grow up, about what kind of father you are? What do you want? No matter what mistakes they make, what do you want them to look at you like? What do you want your coworkers to say about you as in your ethics, your behavior, your speech, your honesty? So what are you going to let go of and take hold of so you can paint that kind of future and have that kind of vision for your future? Do you have a strategy to make it happen? What is your intent? What is your intent? Intent is this. It's that look in the mirror moment that we all have where you say, I'm going to start changing today, and I'm going to quit talking about it, and I'm going to quit talking about it, and I'm actually going to start walking toward it. And I want you to understand there's two things that always drive intent. One of them is positive, one's not so positive. The first thing that always drives our intent and leads to a decision or a choice to change is pain. That's when you wake up one day because of all the bad choices that you've made and you go, you know what, I can't take it anymore. I can't do this anymore. Maybe even I don't want to live anymore. I can't handle it anymore. And out of desperation, because you have not read and followed the directions, you change your intent. Or there's another motivating driving factor behind intent. You know what it is? It's hope. That's what God has in store for you. He wants to give you hope. And through the directions that Jesus gave, that's what we're going to pick. That's where we're going to pick us up next week. So here's what I'm going to do. Guys, I'm going to give you all a little piece of homework. You don't have to have a pencil for it. I want you to read Genesis 1 through 3. Now, before I go any further, when I said that last night, I just said Genesis 1 through 3. I actually had a guy come up to me and said, are you talking about Genesis, the first 3 verses? No. Chapters 1 through 3. Okay, just for clarification. And you say, well, I don't read a Bible. I don't know where to go. I don't know how to do it. You pick up a Bible, you go to the first page and turn it. And you're at Genesis 1. It's real easy to find. And you read Genesis chapters 1 through 3. Take you about 10 minutes. And as you're reading that, here's your assignment. I want you to ask yourself one question. One very simple question. According to what I'm reading here in Genesis 1 through 3, what does God say that as a man I'm supposed to do? And then you come back next week and we'll talk about it. So I'm going to pray. We're going to head into a time of communion. I'm going to invite the guys while I'm praying, if you don't mind, to get up and go to the stations. We're going to serve communion. I hope you'll reflect on some of these questions and reflect upon a man who had to make a decision one day to either follow the orders and the directions of God the Father or had another decision to make. And Jesus said, even though it was going to be painful, I'm going to choose to do what the Father has told me to do. And on the other side of the resurrection, he understood that it was all about having hope. That's my prayer for us this morning too. that through taking these emblems that we're going to take, this cup and this bread, you don't have to, you can pass it. But as you hold it and you contemplate and you think about it, and you think about the directions and intuitively what God has put in you that you know all too well, I want to challenge you to come up with a plan, a strategy to fulfill the Father's will in your life. Because it's the best life possible. It's the one that can eliminate the most pain this side of heaven. So let's pray about it, and then we'll take communion, and hopefully you'll think about it on your own. Father, we're just knocked on our heels by your word every single time we begin to look at it. And sometimes it's almost overwhelming. But I do want to pause for a moment and just thank you for putting the tension inside of every one of us in this room, the right knowledge of knowing right and wrong, good and evil. For too long, we've settled for knockoffs. And you keep coming back in a lot of different ways through a lot of different methods, trying to give us the real deal, the original. And we keep buying into the lie that Satan is throwing at us at every turn. Especially when it comes to who you created us to be, male and female. I pray, God, that we would learn those roles correctly. That we would take the personal responsibility to find out more about what that really, really, truly, truly means. Because that's the only thing that's going to stand up over time. So if there's anyone here that needs you, Father, I pray that today they would not leave this building without a conversation with you. And then if they need to, a conversation with us about being, renewed or born again, as your word says. And so I pray during this time of communion and reflection we will contemplate that. And we ask it in Jesus' holy and precious name. Amen.